In 2015, the UN launched the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 goals, and unlike its predecessor, the MDGs, the SDGs are actually directed at all countries and not just developing countries. So this gives us actually an opportunity to look at issues here at home in Canada, and one of these areas is Indigenous health. And I'm delighted to have Suzanne Stewart here, one of my colleagues, who is an expert in Indigenous health matters. She's going to talk to us a little bit about these areas. So my first question for you is, who are the Indigenous peoples in Canada and how many live in Canada?
Thank you, Professor De Ruggiero. According to 2016 federal census data, there are almost 2 million Indigenous peoples living in Canada. Indigenous peoples are comprised of 3 distinct cultural groups: the First Nations, who are status and non-status Indians; the Métis, who were created from the intermarriage of the James Bay Cree and the French fur trappers in the 1700s and 1800s; and the Inuit, who are the original peoples from the far north of Canada. Around 70% or so of the Indigenous population is First Nations, with Métis accounting for about 1/3 and Inuit accounting for a very small percentage of the overall population. The Indigenous population of Canada has a lot of within-group difference and is mainly identified by being either rural and reserve populations, that is, living in small isolated communities in the north and away from cities, or as urban populations living in towns, villages, and large metropolitan centers across the country.
Thanks for that. We do know that the historical and social cultural context actually influences Indigenous health. Can you give us an example of those contextual influences and how they influence our ability to measure mortality among Indigenous peoples?
So before first contact with Europeans in the late 1400s, Indigenous people had very complex and successful systems for health, for politics, for villages, for family systems. And first contact with Europeans really brought exposure to new diseases and new foods, disruption to community, and the disruption to the transmission of traditional knowledges, including traditional knowledges related to health and healthcare. It also brought with it cross-cultural interactions, which actually had a detrimental effect on Indigenous people through the creation of the Indian Act, which made many aspects of Indigenous culture and life illegal in Canada.
Okay. So I guess my next question would have to do with, so you've said to us how many people we think live in Canada, but we also have data on our Indigenous peoples, but I've also heard that these are underestimates. Can you maybe tell us, maybe working through an example as to why we have underestimates of Indigenous people and why this matters to measuring mortality?
Well, there are some serious issues with the integrity of Indigenous health data, and that has to do with what I alluded to in the beginning about how the population is dispersed. Around 70% of Indigenous people live in urban areas and in cities, 30% around there living on reserves or rural remote communities. All of the data to do with health mostly is collected from these small rural and Indian reserve communities that have certain populations that are affected by the social and political construction of those isolated areas that they live in. The rest of the population, 70% of the population, live in cities and towns where their data is not captured in any of the health studies because they aren't identifiable within the general population. So generally speaking, most Indigenous health data comes from these small, isolated reserve communities, which sometimes have as little as 50, 80, 200 people. And that data, which shows very high prevalence of health problems, such as suicidality, tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS, mental health problems, that limited amount of data from those tiny populations ends up being generalized to this larger population that really has no link to the social determinants of health in these small communities.
So I think you're really highlighting some really important problems around that pose challenges for our health information systems, which in turn drive how we make decisions about policies and programs that help to improve health for Indigenous peoples. So there are many paths, I'm sure, to get there in terms of improving health information systems for Indigenous people. But if you had to name one next step in terms of that, what really needs to change to improve the quality of Indigenous data?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think really the next step would be granting autonomy to Indigenous communities and peoples both on and off Indian reserves to have control over their health systems and their health research. And that would really augment the integrity and the validity of the data that's collected, as well as create services that are grounded in Indigenous knowledges and grounded in Indigenous systems of health.
Right. So maybe just to conclude, I just wanted to take us back now to the SDGs. So they've set, and all countries have set very aggressive targets to be met by 2030. For example, a recent review by the Brookings Institute suggested that Canada would need to drop its suicide rate by 1/3. You've already alluded to this, that suicide does affect smaller communities, First Nations youth and others in those communities. If we were to take that example, how do you think we could improve the robustness of our health information systems to actually prevent and address the causes of suicides? So what could we do differently?
Well, Indigenous suicidality, like other Indigenous health issues, is really something that needs to be examined from the Indigenous paradigm. And the Indigenous definition of health is holistic. Indigenous health is defined as balance within and between the four sacred aspects of the self, the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional, with health really being understood as grounded in spirituality and connection to the land.
Well, we really could talk about these issues for hours. They're very complex, but there are a few takeaways I'd like to leave you with. One is that measurement challenges among Indigenous populations are very complex. They're very contingent on a very deep understanding of the social, cultural, and historical context. However, we can do better in this country, and we could really improve health information systems if a couple of things happen. And I would say the most important is to ensure that Indigenous leaders are at the center of building these health information systems so that every life matters and that every life is counted. This will take us also a long way towards achieving the SDGs by 2030.